All right, welcome to a brand new episode of the Shockwave Skullsessions podcast. This is episode number 49, and it's a long one. It's about an hour and a half. We got Horace Cordier along with Bob Mayo, two hardcore metal enthusiasts. As you may recall, a couple episodes back, we posted an archive episode of Ye Old Metal that featured myself with author Martin Popoff along with my good friend John Stranansky and David Teds, and got a lot of great response for that. That was actually an archive episode from back in, I believe, 2015. So thought we'd do something a little bit similar, going through a lot of the underground hard rock and metal albums from the 70s. And we dig deep underground. For all you true metalheads out there, you will absolutely love this episode. We go through 10 underground hard rock heavy metal classics from the 70s. We were trying to get actually 20 albums on this episode, but doing 10 already took us to about 90 minutes. So we'll definitely do a part 2 and possibly a part 3. But without further ado, let's get right into it. I want to remind you once again, this is the Shockwave Skullsessions podcast. You can check it out on Spreaker, iTunes, or as it's called now, Apple Music or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and many other podcast directories. You can also check us out at our home site at shockwaveskullsessions.com. And be sure to check out the upcoming Inside Metal movie Bay Area Godfathers. We are doing a very special matinee screening Sunday, March 29th at noon at the Roxy Theater in San Francisco. So that's going to be our exclusive screening for this movie. And then the DVD and digital should be coming out late spring, early summer. So be on the lookout for that. For those interested in coming out to the screening, just go to the Roxy Theater website. That's RIXIE Theater in San Francisco. And you can actually order advance tickets online. We are selling a very limited number of tickets to the public, so you better do it quickly. With that said, let's get right into it. This is Shockwave Skullsessions podcast number 49 with Bob Mayo and Horace Cordier. All right, Shockwave Skullsessions, a brand new episode here. I got two extreme old school metal fans here and two newcomers to the Skullsessions podcast. Thanks to our master Monty Connor for basically hooking this one up. Of course, both you guys are a part of our email thread, and I've been telling you, I've been teasing you for a few months now about getting you guys on a podcast, and this one seems to work out really good. Something of interest to both of you. We got Bob Mayo. Many of you guys might know East Coast thrash legend from the band Wargasm from 85 to 95. And was it the Profile Records you guys were on, right?
For the first record, we were on Profile. Yeah, it's called While I Play Around.
Did you guys play? You played around with like SOD and Agnostic Front and bands like Overkill?
Yeah, all of the above. Yeah, we worked with Chris Williamson. He's the one who signed us to Profile.
Profile, right.
We were on a lot of shows. We played the Ritz several times. So, yeah, I guess we were kind of part of that scene.
And we got, for our second guest, Horace Cordier. Is that correct?
Cordier. I don't really care one way or the other. I'm honestly not even sure myself. My father's Belgian. It's not French. That's the only thing everybody thinks it's French.
Okay, that's why I wasn't sure how to
Belgian.
pronounce.
Though I love the French, so I don't take offense if someone thinks it's French. But it's actually Belgian. So, but I also love Belgian metal too. So it's all good.
There you go. Crossfire, right? Remember them?
Crossfire. Actually, my favorite is Acid.
Acid, yes. What was her name? Kate, right? The singer?
Kate. I'll actually be seeing her at Keep It True. They're reforming Acid for that gig. So,
wow.
First time in 20 years, they're actually reforming the Engine Beast lineup of Acid.
All right. Well, very cool. Again, old school hard rock metal guy. And why I keep saying that is that you'll find out because that is what basically the subject matter of this podcast is. It's going to be underground heavy metal classics from the 70s. And Bob grew up with Aerosmith and Cheap Trick's Heaven Tonight and Kiss Rock and Roll Over. And I'm
actually, those are my albums that I got. My sister introduced me to heavy rock, and I remember she brought home, it was a big day, she brought home Aerosmith Rocks, Kiss Rock and Roll Over, Aerosmith Rocks, and it was kind of all downhill from there. So I was kind of hooked on the spot.
All right.
Well, that's really funny.
And Cheap Trick Heaven Tonight.
That's funny because the first record I ever bought with my own money was Kiss Rock and Roll Over. And
Really?
obviously,
Wow.
yeah. Obviously, growing up about 20 minutes south of Boston in the 70s, you could not escape being a huge Aerosmith fan, and Rocks was the first record I bought from them as well when it was on the radio.
I remember the day that album came out. It was huge because, of course, Toys in the Attic. And this, I grew up in L.A. on the West Coast. And, of course, we had the Cal Jam 2 with Nugent and Aerosmith. And, so they were already playing these, huge festivals, even on the West Coast. And I remember Rocks. I just remember getting it that day and just being so blown away. My first album I got, I can't say it was with my own money, but it was as a birthday present, was Black Sabbath Sabotage, and that was the year it came out, I believe in 75 on my 11th birthday. I just remember my mom just freaking out, looking at the album cover, because she said, you could buy any album you want, and I went to the local store, 70's, and I said, this is it. This is what, because my cousin turned me on. She just looks at that album cover. If you're not familiar with it, Google the Sabotage album cover, and you can see.
Both myself and Bob Mayo are massive Sabotage fans. As a matter of fact, it's my favorite Black Sabbath album. I think it's a stone cold masterpiece. Are we allowed to use profanity, or do I need to be careful?
Absolutely. And
it's a fucking masterpiece as far as I'm concerned.
My favorite fucking album of all time is Sabotage, with a quick very close behind would be Rainbow Rising. That's kind of my take on
both of those would make my list. But to quickly tell you my Black Sabbath story, which is really amazing, hearing this from you, is the first album that I ever bought with my own money as a kid was Black Sabbath, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and I had not heard a note of the band's music. I bought it completely because of the album cover.
Yeah.
and it worked out quite well. And then my sister bought a Grateful Dead album, and she was absolutely furious because it didn't sound anything. She thought she was getting like another Black Sabbath kind of band. She was like, this stuff is terrible. How could they have that album cover?
Not a great strategy.
All right. And just so people know, Horace, a huge fan, over 4,000 CDs, and a big collector of a Japanese metal, which we'll maybe get on a future podcast. We got to get you on for that. We've been talking to Marty Friedman, and when he's free,
you got to get me on with Marty for that. We'll Marty, and he lives there, and he's Marty Friedman. So hopefully, maybe that'll happen at some point.
That'll be a great conversation, seeing you, because Marty, of course, everyone knows he lives in Japan, but he's hugely into the old school Japanese metal bands as well. So anyway,
Marty's also a guy you never hear a bad word about. Anyway, yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. So, basically, as I said, we're going to basically go through 20 albums. I'm sorry. 20 albums that we just kind of went back and forth about 20 underground classic metal albums from the 70s. That's the key. It's got to be released sometime during the 70s. And between the three of us, we came up with a list. And then we also came up with 10 honorable mentions that we'll go through toward the end. So, of course, there's so many great records. I'm sure there's many that we might have left out. Should we kind of explain underground? Because, I mean, there were certain albums that we were kind of questionable about. I know, like Status Quo, of course, very underground here in the States. But, in the rest of the world, they're like the Rolling Stones. So, we didn't really count them as underground. But mostly we kind of as underground here in the States, because some of these bands, like the first one we're going to get into, Golden Earring, of course, in all over Europe, particularly Holland, where they're from. They're a huge band. And people could argue, well, they had, and I'm saying this because I know I'm going to get emails or people going, Golden Earring, they had 2 massive hits here in the U.S. How could you call them underground? But the album that we're going to get into, Seven Tears, which I believe that was your choice, Horace, correct?
Yeah, I had a
which I
both
agree
me
with.
And Bob Mayo are massive Golden Earring fans. It was very hard to pick a Golden Earring album because they have a really wildly divergent. It's an incredible career because they've explored so many different kinds of sounds. But if we're talking about the 70s stuff, they have more sort of progressive. I'm a big fan of a record of theirs called To the Hilt, but it's a slightly different sound. Seven Tears to me is kind of the first one where they're kind of getting it together in their really distinctive sound, which to me is they've managed to kind of mix the Who, the Doors, and some flute and Jethro Tull progressive elements. But there's they're a very sinister band, and I think that's part of what makes them so fascinating to me. There's a really dark undercurrent there, and I'm a huge fan of that record because it has what I consider to be their first really big epic, which is "She Flies on Strange Wings," which is a huge sprawling kind of epic number.
Absolutely agree with Horace. Their catalog is just so huge. And even sticking to the 70s, which is probably 10 records, there's still a good 5 or 6 of those albums that could have been appropriate for this discussion. But I would have gone with 7 Tears as well, because "She Flies on Strange Wings" is just a monster. It's an epic tune. It's very intense, and there is a sinister edge to it, as Horace said too. I think a lot of their sinister energy comes from Barry Hayes' vocals, which are very distinct. He really has a very intense way of delivering a lyric.
Absolutely.
And he really does so on this particular song. Like I said, it's a monster, and I recommend it to anyone who's interested in hearing what happened between those two hits. Definitely check out "She Flies on Strange Wings," if not the entire album, 7 Tears.
That was a huge hit, "She Flies on Strange Wings," and throughout Europe, right? Particularly in Holland, from what I understand.
Yeah. I mean, to quickly, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I may be the biggest United States-based Golden Earring fan, to the point where I've traveled to Holland twice to see them live. Because they don't. I saw them on their 50th anniversary concert. It was absolutely amazing. And, I'm friends with a guy named Robert Hogasma, who's a Dutch music journalist, and basically he knows that, I completely worship that band. So I was over there at a stadium where I'm the only guy from America, and everybody thought I was completely insane. They were like, "You came all the way over from America for this?" I'm like, "Yeah, this is my favorite band." But to get into the sound briefly, there's just so much going on there. And, Bob Mayo and I have talked about this on numerous occasions. They have absolutely one of the greatest drummers in the world in that band. I mean,
greatest rhythm section, man. Bassist, drummer.
And Rhinus.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Rhinus on bass.
Is
yeah.
incredible.
Absolutely.
And when the two of those guys are at it together, they're really untouchable. And I actually was told by someone that at one point The Who, before they took Kenny Jones, Cesar was a serious consideration to join The Who. So that shows you how good he is. And I agree with Bob about Rhinus, who, when I was watching the concert, I was like, this guy's unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, just the hit songs alone, Radar Love and Twilight Zone, the two, known songs here in the U.S., probably the only songs people know of Golden Earring here. Just the rhythms and that song, the bass and drums, just the way they lock in and groove. And the great thing about this band, being from Holland, and I believe this particular album was released in 1971, but of course their catalog throughout the 1970s had such a great, soulful, funky feel. And especially with the rhythm section and of course the vocalist Barry, it's incredibly soulful, but which was quite astonishing how soulful they sound, and the different instrumentations, and how they could go from, as you say, a progressive kind of band and have that kind of Jethro Tull's flute kind of sound, and then go into something so soulful. Such an underrated band here in America, anyway. Those two hit songs. I can see why they are the hit songs. And Twilight Zone came out in the early '80s, so I think they were 15 years apart. They had a hit songs in the States, but they were on basically the 10-year plan. And the other thing that makes that band fascinating is you are looking at the longest stable lineup, I think, of almost any classic rock band. Great
point. They have had the same members in place since pretty much 1969, with the sole exception being not that anybody left, but at one point a guy named Echo Jelling, they added a second guitarist for a couple of albums. And then they decided that they sort of didn't need that, and they got rid of him. But they're all in good health. They still tour regularly in the Benelux countries, and they're together. So they've outlasted the Rolling Stones. They've outlasted the Who.
ZZ Top would be the other band that you would think with the original members.
You're right. ZZ Top. Yeah. So we're talking ZZ Top and Golden Earring. And one little last funny Golden Earring factoid. I know he's a hugely controversial figure, but There's a very interesting clip on YouTube where Ted Nugent, of all people, talks about
I saw
touring
that.
with
I was
Golden
actually saw it. He was talking about the rhythm section.
Absolutely
Yeah.
gives them massive props.
Yeah.
He's like, those guys had the most killer fucking rhythm section I've ever seen. He's like,
Absolutely.
can't say enough. And he actually talks about the funk, the groove, the soul. He's like, they've got like Sam, I don't know. He's like, they've got like funk in there.
Yeah. No, they definitely do, which is, you know, I mean, not so rare, obviously, particularly from the British bands, from you know, the Faces to Humble Pie to Zeppelin to the Stones. You know, that was obvious, but it is pretty interesting that it really transferred over to bands in Holland. And you got to remember, this album in particular, 7 Tears, came out in 1971. So we're talking, you know, very, very early on. And was this their second album?
No,
they existed for many years before that, actually, and they were kind of a pop group. And they had a little bit of a different lineup, but when they solidified on the lineup that is with us still today, I guess in my mind this is their second record, but it's really probably, you know, not counting all the singles they released, it's probably their fourth or fifth, Horace.
Yeah, I mean, I can very quickly look at it now, but essentially I'll do this very fast. They began life as before the Beatles, or around the same time as the Beatles. They began life as something called a Niederbeat group, they were a Dutch beat pop group. Wow. And they had very short songs. Everything's like 2 minutes. The titles are things like Kiki Kiki Dong Dong, Be My Girl, you know, this kind of thing. And they didn't really become the band that we know and love until Barry Hay joined. And that's, I think, 1967 or so. And to me, they really become the band that we love when César joins. And that's, I think, on Together, which is the 1970 album. Now, they have one great album before that, which is called 8 Miles High, where they do an incredible cover of the Byrds song. But that has a guy named Steve Warner on drums. And it's sort of the odd album out before César joins. But once César comes in, then they become, you know. So as far as 7 Tears goes, it's their third record with César on drums, and kind of the fourth record since they turned to a more hard rock, sort of a melding of The Who and The Doors, which is essentially what they were sort of, and Jethro Tull, they were trying to sort of mix those three things together. And that's what they really set on that path with the 8 Miles High record. And that's 1969.
Now, in the 60s, when you were talking about, were they actually called Golden Earring when they first started out? Or was
they were called the Golden Earrings. So one of the only distinction is that little letter S.
Interesting.
So the Golden Earrings are the Kiki Kiki, you know, and they put out the equivalent of 3 full-length albums. Bob Mayo and I know all this because we have the Complete Studios recording box, and they actually include all of those recordings, so you can hear that stuff. And for beat pop, it's not bad stuff,
right?
But it's not, you know, it's just a different sound.
You know, again, it's funny with me, there were certain bands from the 70s that I grew up on. And then the bands, you know, once like the 80s came about, I got full on into like the new wave of British heavy metal and all that. And then
Me too. Yeah.
And then I kind of backtracked, and, you know, I was still going to use records, and I would buy their albums after. So I probably didn't have the same effect as if I heard these albums like when they came out in the 70s or when I was younger, before I was spoiled with the new wave of British heavy metal, all this great heavy stuff, you know, because at that point it was like, nothing was heavy enough.
I was always attracted to sort of dark themed entertainment, and my whole intro to Golden Earring was once again an album cover, which is the one for Hilt, which has this insane hypnosis cover where, you know, it's a staked vampire, there's some thing coming up a guy's neck. And it's one of the craziest images I've ever seen. And so I saw that and I said, that looks really twisted. Let me hear this. And then, you know, I sort of liked it. And so I sort of became like this, you know, guy in the USA that loved this band, and other people were like, wait, didn't those guys break up after Radar Love? I'm like, no. So, anyway.
Well, Mad Dog, I get what you're saying, because if you're looking for heavy metal, like if you're in the new wave of British heavy metal in the 80s and that's what's enrapturing you at the moment, and you're looking for that guitar metal, that's not Golden Earring. But if you're looking for fantastic ensemble playing, like you'll find on a record like Who's Next, where every element of the band is completely firing at a super high level, and they're gelling together. Like you wouldn't believe that this is the kind of band that you're looking for.
All right, should we?
And we'll be here all night on Golden Earrings. So I think,
like I said, I tried to do a little bit of homework last night. I was so busy, I was getting caught up on some of these bands that I was aware of, but again, just wasn't that familiar with. And Golden Earring is definitely one of them. I'm going to get really
Mayo
into.
and I will be happy to co-pilot you.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, guys. But let's move on to Bang. I guess the band's debut record. We are talking. That would be Death of a Country, right? Was that their debut or their here?
Death of a Country is the album that they recorded before the debut, but the record company, for whatever reason, decided it wasn't acceptable, and so they went with the self-titled one that opens with Lions Christians. Okay. Then many, many years later, it was sort of the lost Bang album. Right. And so many, many years later, Death of a Country, which is a great record too, but it got released many years later as sort of the lost Bang album. The thing with Bang for me, and I don't know if Mayo agrees with me on this, the thing with me and Bang is I really feel like I like their other records, but to me, they're a really great example of a band that really got their shit together on one album. And then the rest of the catalog is interesting, but it just never touches the quality of like that one album. And that one album is the one that has, the circular exploding bullet with Lions Christians. So the one that we know as Bang.
And that's the debut that came out in 1972. I'm looking at it now on Capitol Records.
72 Capitol Records.
Right? Yeah, interesting. Bob Mayo, what are your thoughts on the debut Bang record?
I am not a huge fan of this band or this record. I did check it out. Those years when you're delving back in time to see what you missed when you were growing up. And I did come across this. It just doesn't do it for me. I think sometimes records languish in obscurity because sometimes they're just not that great. I understand all the boxes are checked off here. It's probably deserves to be mentioned as a proto-metal classic because all the boxes are ticked off. But sound-wise and riff-wise and all that, I just don't think this record rises to the level of a classic record. It's very derivative of Sabbath. I know that
yes.
This singer is definitely he's coming from a place where he's worshiping Ozzy. He's emulating Ozzy, frankly. And the guitar players are pretty strong. It just never really gels enough to be compelling to me, really. And I've heard it. So I've given it several tries over the years. I do own it, but it just never really. I always go back to it and say, "What did I miss? What did I miss that last time?" And I could never find it.
There's always going to be albums like that. We've all got those. We've got the ones where everybody's like, "This is like an unheralded classic," and you listen to it and you're like, "What?" So I mean, I can completely respect that. And I will say this, and I'm a huge fan of that record. It is derivative. This is not it's not wild and off the rails like something we're going to discuss later, like Night Sun. It's not, holy shit, what the hell are we like hearing here, like Lucifer's Friend. It doesn't have that kind of like the Lucifer's Friend debut. It doesn't have that kind of, shocking, like what the hell thing for me. But for me, it's like, a band that didn't really make it. That were sort of plying a sound at a time when that sound just was kind of thin on the ground. So it was just good to hear. And in my weird Bang stories, I've actually seen them live. They actually played a small club. They played St. Vitus, and it was like, didn't even know they were playing. And like that day, I was like, you know what? And I went all by myself, got on the subway, went out to see them at St. Vitus. And I think it was before I was friends with Monty, but I think he was at the same show.
Wow.
Monty's a Bang fan. And there were like 10 people there. And to me, that first Bang album, the best song on it is Lions Christians because it has that opening riff where it goes like, so it's got, that. But what Mayo was saying, I totally get it. We're all going to have those records where we're just like, I don't get it.
I think it fits in with all the rest of the records that we're going to talk about today. It definitely fits squarely in that wheelhouse, but to me, it just doesn't do it for me.
Yeah. Well, you make a really good point, Bob, because this is something we've done a similar podcast, an old Skullsessions with Martin Popoff, and he has his ye old metal books. And well, it's funny. I just mentioned Martin Popoff, and I get the laughter.
And let me say for the record, for everybody that's listening, I love.
We all love Martin.
I bought most of his fucking books, but I think if I have to like list the guy that drives me the most crazy as Monty can drive me, it's probably Martin, where I just go, what the hell did I just read? Okay.
But, the point of that podcast and what Bob is saying is so true. And of course, as everyone knows, Martin, he will always love the albums that everyone else hates, or we'll say so-and-so is the best record, but he'll go into, especially with the Ye Olde Metal, all these kind of underground, so to speak, classics. And I would say the same. There's a difference between these albums and, the Black Sabbaths and the Judas Priests and the, Aerosmiths and whatever. There's a reason why those albums were big and these weren't. They're just not nearly as good. And people now try to put a lot of these bands on a pedestal that, right. I remember even buying them as a kid, like buying these used records and going and just listening to the Bang. And I thought it was the same thing, very derivative, very like an American band trying to sound like Sabbath. And it's just like, well, there's a reason why this band didn't really make it. Not to sound mean or anything, but when you have bands like Sabbath and other bands, but now, I think now with the internet and people are like trying to, I discovered this band. Well, this band should have been like Black Sabbath. And you listen back, it's like, no, there's a reason they weren't as big. And I think in the 70s, the record companies were a lot smarter in the sense that where in the 80s, even the big bands, you could say, wow, they don't just, they were just kind of formulated into this certain sound. But I think the bands from the 70s had a natural sound, and they were either great or they just weren't they were a second tier band. And, I think, many of the bands on our list would probably be considered second tier bands, but, many of them are definitely underground classics, so to speak, but they're just not as good.
You also have to deal with that very crucial aspect, which is at what point did you discover something?
True.
And that has a huge effect on the trajectory. So, Bang were an early discovery for me because of a very controversial book by a guy named Chuck Eddy called Stairway to Hell.
I remember Chuck.
The one where he's like the greatest heavy metal albums of all time, and Tina Marie winds up as like number 3. You can't even make this shit up. But the book
I have that book.
Yeah.
I have the book, and I read it like once every couple of years, and it makes me furious every time I read it, but I keep going back to it.
Exactly. However, what I will say is thanks to Chuck Eddy, and I'm going to thank Chuck Eddy for this, I discovered Bang when I was just beginning my journey on underground metal, and an album that we have not discussed, which I can't believe this never came up because it's one of my absolute favorites, the incredible Australian band Buffalo, who had an album called Volcanic Rock.
I'm surprised I wasn't on your list.
The thing is, you do these lists and you forget things. I'm punching myself bloody right now because I'm a huge fan of Volcanic Rock. So anyway, we need to do part 2. But anyway, I discovered a few albums thanks to that book, and Mayo's completely correct. There was so much insane shit in that book, but the guy actually turned me on to a few bands that are like all-time favorites.
Well, it reminds me, did he write for Cream in the early days? I think it was it Cream?
Yeah, might have.
Yeah, I believe it was, because I remember Cream magazine. That was where before Kerrang came out and before I got into Sounds and Kerrang and all that. It was all Cream, the metal. I mean, you had Circus, you had Hip Parader, but Cream had those specialty metal issues. If you remember from the late 70s up until like 1980. They would have a special, and they would have all articles. You see Atomic Rooster, and that's where I first read about little blurbs about Saxon or the band Marseille, the new wave of British heavy metal band, or
Marseille,
Def Leppard. Yes, exactly. There were like 3 or 4 bands mentioned. Magnum was one of them, and I would read about all these bands, Blood Rock, Bang, Atomic Rooster, and you would never know. And I was so young, I didn't really know, but I read back at it now, and you hear the sarcasm, and these people hated metal, these journalists, and of course they were all into the new wave thing.
Yeah, the Rolling Stone record guide would drive you insane.
They were so sarcastic, and they tried to be so sophisticated, and they would just rip into these bands. But I didn't know any better. I just saw, heavy. This is heavy metal, so I would go check it out.
Chuck Eddy used to write reviews for Cream. He had a couple of reviews in every issue. And I would read them as a kid, and I would think, okay, that was funny, but do you like it or do you not like it?
Exactly.
Should I buy it or should I not buy it?
So just to feed their ego, these journalists back then, that was what they did.
And here's the thing. If you're a snarky 13-year-old kid with attitude problems, if you read something that says, this band, makes me want to commit suicide. That first Uriah Heep album review, I'm like, where can I find this record?
Absolutely. That's how I was too, because that's why I knew it was good. If they talk shit about it or they said, because back then, I've said this in previous podcasts, they used the term heavy metal as a derogatory term. This is heavy metal garbage. And when I'd ever see that, I would go, oh, this has got to be great, And
well, we have to face the fact, which is kind of amazing, is that we've lived to see Black Sabbath celebrated as like the pioneers of this amazing musical form, adored and loved. The band was absolutely reviled when they were at like the peak of their commercial powers. The establishment had no fucking use for Black Sabbath.
They hated Zeppelin. They hated a lot of these bands.
Despised them. Music for drug addicts, music for juvenile delinquents, stone morons. Every insult you could come up with.
In the Rolling Stone record guide, this is Horace. This is in one of my blog posts about. It's called "Critics Bloody Critics." It's about the way that critics hated Sabbath in the 70s, and I pulled together a bunch of different reviews. One of the things I highlight is in the Rolling Stone record guide, first edition, Paranoid got like a D-.
That's right.
The second and third editions, it got a C. And as you move forward in time, it's got a B- and an A+, and it just continues. As the decades pass, it's reevaluated.
Typical Rolling Stone.
Survived. Yeah, well, the band survived long enough to outlive all their detractors and the generational shift that happened, and metal got accepted, and now they're the godfathers. They were considered complete hacks.
Oh, absolutely.
And now they're God.
And I'll tell you my quick Sabbath thing, and it made a huge impression. As I was lucky enough to see them in 99 with, Bill Ward on drums on, I guess, the first big Reformation tour.
I saw that tour, very first show they did in Phoenix, at the Banks One
incredible,
Stadium. Yeah,
and amazing. And my story, and I'll never forget it, is I walked through the parking lot for that concert, and I had never in my life seen, I think there were 4 generations of people there. There were 13-year-old kids, a 10-year-old kid, 65-year-old dudes, and everybody was going nuts. And I remember I was halfway across the parking lot, and this 60-year-old guy just stopped with his kid. He had a young kid, and he just stopped and he goes, "It's fucking Sabbath." And everybody was going crazy. And I'm like, this band has reached so many people, so many generations, and something about them spoke to so many people that the establishment, they totally fucking missed it. Yeah. They just didn't get it.
They didn't want to get it.
They didn't want to get it. You're right.
It threatened the status quo back at the time when the 60s were turning into the 70s and the hippies were into the flower power and the positivity and all that. And Sabbath came out, right alongside the Manson murders and all that stuff. And it crashed the party, and they rejected it completely because it wasn't what they were used to writing about. It wasn't what they wanted to write about.
But even into the mid to late 70s, all up and through Ozzy's career through Never Say Die, they hated Sabbath. Because even in the late 70s, it was all about the prog bands. That was their thing. And then, of course, once the 80s came around, they became, all into the new wave thing. But, these guys can't play music. You got to play like Genesis or Peter Gabriel or ELP. So they've always had it.
And the most amusing aspect of all that is that all those prog and more technical guys, a lot of them love Sabbath. Brian May is a massive Black Sabbath fan. Tony Iommi is.
Oh, Rick Wakeman. Rick Wakeman played on many of the Sabbath albums. These guys all love
Sabbath. They were like, you guys get to do something so fun. This is great.
I know this is going to end up being a 2-hour podcast.
And we need to get on to the next.
I think I made a mistake by picking 20. We might have to go. We'll see how long we can go on this here. All right. Okay. Well, one of my favorite. The next one of my favorite French bands, and I'm so glad you reminded me of this. I don't know if it was Horace or Bob. I believe Horace. You reminded me of the.
I'm probably the world's biggest USA Trust fan.
Trust.
Right, there you go.
Yes, their debut, which was my favorite, in 1979, I believe that came out, and again, nobody knew about them in America. But what was astonishing is the following year, I believe it was 1980, when that heavy metal soundtrack came out. That, Sammy Hagar did that for the movie Heavy Metal, the animation movie. They were actually on the soundtrack, and a song from
because they were CBS artists.
Right? That makes sense. Yeah,
that's a fascinating soundtrack, because you also get a very good
Don Felder
sort of outtake that was buried for a while.
That's true. Record. That's true. Yeah,
and you get the 2 fantastic Cheap Trick tracks. with the new bassist, right? Cheap Trick have 2 songs, and for a long time was the only place you could get them. Now with those beautiful Japanese remasters, they put those on as bonus tracks. One's called Reach Out, and the other's called I Must Be Dreamin', and they're both pretty good songs. And at one point, they were orphan Cheap Trick tracks that were only available on that soundtrack.
All right. Well, why don't you start off, Horace, since you are such a huge Trust fan?
All right, so I'll do Trust quickly. This is not actually my favorite Trust album. That would be Repression, which is the one that follows this and has the famous song Antisocial, which we all know because Anthrax covered it and probably paid for those Trust members' houses or whatever. But the thing with Trust is there's a couple of interesting things about the band. I'll try to do this more quickly. They had massive AC/DC connections. Bernie Von Weisen was a close personal friend of Bon Scott's and was one of the last people, I think, to see Bon alive. Bon died in Paris. I think Bernie had been with him. And at one point, my profile picture was this amazing photo of the lead vocalist from Trust and Bon Scott having a conversation about something. Somebody took this incredible photo, and they were very close friends to the point where on this Trust debut, they cover Ride On, the AC/DC.
That's correct. Great version, too.
The other interesting thing about Trust is they were a fiercely political band. Probably even more political than most punk bands. But the thing is, because they were speaking in French, even I don't speak fluent French, so I can't fully decipher it. I do have a friend who speaks fluent French, and he was like, this is some serious raging communist shit. He's like, these guys are like off the hook. It's like shoot the cops, riot in the street. It's like very, very angry political kind of rock. And if you listen to that debut, that's a huge theme that goes through it, starting with Police Milice, which is basically police, military bad, the elite, which is what you probably think it is. And I think everything else on there is basically some sort of like, can we get an army together, riot in the street to take the country back? So you have this really aggressive political thing with a kind of an AC/DC based sound. And the thing I would say with Trust is the real key to their sound is you have a really great kind of rough vocalist and a very skilled guitarist who's got a little bit of
awesome.
There.
Oh yeah, brilliant bluesy guitar player.
Yeah, he's a very good. No is really great, and they over the course. The other great Trust factoid is that they had the unique trick of using 2, not 1, but 2 Iron Maiden drummers during the course of their career. There's a Trust album with Clive Burr on drums, album with Nico McBrain
on drums. With Nico.
Nico is on March and Die, and Clive is on Trust 4, which has Ideal, which was their...
That's a great record.
And Clive is really good on that record. So I know a lot of people are big.
That's right.
Mayo and I are huge drum guys. I love Clive Burr, and it's actually one of Clive's best drum performances is on the Trust album.
Well, a lot of those bands were huge Trust fans, including Iron Maiden and, like you say, AC/DC, and there was a huge amount of respect in the fact that they were one of the few bands out of, you get all the Swedish bands, all the German bands, all the, it was always the French bands that, I don't know if it was because they were French that they were kind of stubborn, like we're going to sing in French and not sing in English. You had some of the Spanish bands of obviously Baron Rojo and stuff, but hearing, but the thing that worked, especially with Trust, I mean, there's other bands. Ocean, I would have brought up that debut album that came out actually in 1980.
I'm nuts about Ocean.
That is fucking
and
amazing.
Shaken Street is another good one.
Yeah, and there's so many great bands, but I believe Shaken Street they sang everything in English, correct?
They sang everything in England, but in English. But the thing with Trust is they when they tried to break them internationally,
they did reissue them. And it's not. My point is, it's not near as good. I mean, you could hear like Repression, as you said.
The English versions actually kind of suck.
Yeah, they just don't work, and it's not the band's fault. It's like when you translate something from French to English, it's not going to rhyme. It's not going to flow. It's not going to.
Well, here's a great little weird factoid for your listeners, which is that Bon Scott, you wouldn't imagine this now, would you? Spoke fluent French. Wow. And he was supposed to translate Trust's lyrics for the first 2 albums into English. And then he died. So the guy who did the translations was Jimmy Percy from Sham 69. Jimmy Percy's French wasn't that great. And so those English versions have fairly shitty translations. So another tragedy of the death of Bon Scott was we didn't get his properly translated French lyrics for Trust, which was something that he had promised to do for them before he died. So all sorts of interesting stuff there. The last thing I'll say about Trust is that there is something in French metal in general. French is sort of known as the language of love because it's so beautiful sounding. It amazingly translates well into very aggressive kind of heavy metal. There's something about the nature of the way it sounds where you can't even tell what the hell Bernie is singing about, but it sounds really, really pissed off.
So passionate and pissed. I think that's why a lot of the punks liked Trush. I remember they had a pretty big punk following.
The punks were Trust fans.
Yeah.
And there's a song in the debut, which is the album we're discussing, called Palace, which is their anti-disco song. Yeah. And so it has disco beats in it.
I love that.
And at one point they'll play like the disco thing, and then Bernie goes, rock and roll!
Yeah. Yeah, his vocals, his delivery, and he with that accent, it's almost like he's just spitting out those words, and you just hear the malice in his voice, and Nono's guitar playing, and I think I mentioned in email one of my all-time favorite leads of any band, and it's not like this guy was the most amazing technical guitar player, but Nono's lead in the song L'Elite. The breakdown of that, man, when it goes into that riff and then it just fades into this lead and it just builds up and goes back to it's unbelievable, man. I can't say enough great stuff about this Trust album. I'll leave it to you, Bob Mayo, to finish
Let's do an album where Mayo can talk some.
Okay. Did you want to add anything, Bob?
Yeah. I think an apt comparison with Bernie is Henry Rollins and Black Flag. So, and if you think Henry Rollins sounded committed and angry and passionate in Black Flag, you need to check this record out because this guy is intimidating as hell.
Yes.
And on Repression, it's a little bit more rock and roll on Repression, but this record, he really wants to kill people.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We love you, Bernie. Hopefully you're listening.
All right, shall we move on to Blood Rock? And I guess we're talking their debut album. Is that correct?
The first one, yeah.
Now, I believe that came out in '69. Did it not? I'm going to check right now. Or was
1970.
that 70? Okay. So it made the cut. So why don't you begin with that, Bob? The debut Blood Rock.
This was Horace's pick, but I love this record as well. He probably has more to say about it than I do, but I know that the Terry Knight connection here, I think, is really key because this band tooled around Texas for quite a while in different incarnations. But once they hooked up with Grand Funk Railroad's manager, Terry Knight, he actually named them Blood Rock. And I think he set them into this specific direction of this creepy kind of, this is kind of an overused phrase, I know, but the American Black Sabbath kind of a thing. Another band that was kind of on that same track as Sabbath with the doomy kind of sounds and the lyrics, the dark lyrics. This record, I think, is the best one, even though DOA is on the next one. But this one it's a real great mix of kind of Southern rock and Black Sabbath edge. I think it's their best work. And also, I want to call out the John Nitzinger connection. He co-wrote 4 or 5 songs on this record. He's not in the band.
Okay.
His name is John Nitzinger. He actually is a great guitar player. You may know him from playing in PM with Carl Palmer. You may know him from playing. He played on Alice Cooper's Zipper Catches Skin album. He wrote a lot of those songs. That's an underrated Alice record, by the way.
Yes.
It's considered one of his throwaways, but it's not. It's really great. So this band had a lot of high caliber talent on their side, and it really shows on this record. It's creepy as hell. It's heavy as hell. And the playing is great. The drummer is fantastic. The band plays together extremely well. And again, it has that kind of sinister, Sabbath-y edge to it. And for an American band, I actually think they did the Sabbath thing better than Blue Oyster Cult did, who were kind of launched. They were kind of launched in the same direction. Blue Oyster Cult kind of evolved into their own thing, which was fantastic. But Blood Rock also evolved into something unique as well. But this record is their starting point, and I highly recommend this album. It's fantastic.
All right, Horace.
Yeah, what I would add on it is I very much agree with Mayo on most of what he said. I do think that Stevie Hill should be called out for his contribution, because his keyboard playing is really amazing on this record. And to me, the centerpiece of this album is the final song, which is Melvin Laid an Egg, which is
great title.
brutally heavy. It's a brutally heavy number, and it's got as much to do with a really pissed off Deep Purple as it does a Black Sabbath. It's got that crushing organ, and there's just moments where the organ kind of washes over you. And like Mayo mentioned, the drummer's really great in this band. And you've got like that crushing organ, the drummer, and it's like getting stomped by a dinosaur. And so it's a very, very, very cool record. The second album gets more love because of DOA, which I think is an amazing song, but I don't think the album is overall strong. The other great song on this album is a really long epic called Fantastic Piece of Architecture, which is almost 9 minutes long, and it's kind of like ELP on some really mean drugs. So, I can't say enough good things about this album, but for proto metal, it kind of ticks every box as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, they were a band that kind of, again, I talk about bands that kind of went back to, from reading Cream and whatnot. And, by then I was already much into the heavier stuff, Judas Priest, AC/DC, getting into Motorhead and Saxon. And I think I bought the Blood Rock 3 used. And I thought, again, it was like a poor, and I thought more Deep Purple than Sabbath. And I do hear obviously the Southern, they were from Texas, obviously. So you had a bit of that Southern vibe.
Right.
But to me, it was like, I always thought I was always such a huge fan of the British bands. I mean, I loved Aerosmith. I loved the Montrose and Ted Nugent and whatnot. But, I always thought, just a band trying to be Deep Purple or a band trying to be this. Again, if I heard the album back in the early 70s, it probably would have had much more of an impact on me.
Also, Blood Rock 3
is
sort of considered sort of their jazz album.
Right. That's what
there's a slight change in the sound. And one of the things I've always said about Blood Rock is horror rock. The whole concept of like rock that's supposed to actually scare you is almost impossible. It's usually either comical or it's fun, but you're not really scared. I think DOA genuinely creeps me the fuck out. Car crash, guys dying after a plane crash. And the only things that could even come close to that is a couple of Atomic Rooster songs where I'm like, okay, I could sort of understand why Vincent Crane killed himself. This is very dark.
Yeah.
But it's not an easy thing to pull off.
Not to hammer the Sabbath thing into the ground, but DOA itself, speaking purely musically, that song is basically a rewrite of the song Black Sabbath. After you pointed it out, I was actually able to hear it, and you're absolutely correct. It's got that Devil's Tritone thing. It's in a different key, so it might not be as recognizable, but it's that same move that makes the song Black Sabbath so menacing. It's that same musical move. And it actually even has a different riff at the end, and the song kicks into double speed at the end, just like Black Sabbath as well. So it's kind of, I consider it a rewrite, and it was super effective, and it was obviously a huge hit on the radio in the States, but so it really worked for them. But again, that's just the Sabbath thing happening.
Yeah, see, a lot of the Texas or the Midwest things, because I don't remember even early on, when of that being a hit. Maybe, or at least in the California radio stations. But it's interesting you say about Sabbath, because what we just talked about Sabbath, how the critics hated them. They were obviously huge, although they were never commercially big. They didn't have radio hits and whatnot. But all these record labels were trying to find the American Sabbath. And as you say, the early Blue Oyster Cult, CBS were looking to get them. I mean, CBS wanted Judas Priest to be, they thought they were going to be the next Sabbath, and they were also looking at Pentagram early on to be, the American Sabbath. But with Blue Oyster Cult, they wanted them to write a Sabbathish song. And speaking of kind of the influence of Cities of Flame, this is something that Martin told me about, and then I realized, I listened to it, Cities of Flame takes from The Wizard from Black Sabbath.
Right.
Same riff.
In Martin.
But it's happier. It's too happy. It doesn't work for me.
Those guys sounded more like the Grateful Dead just previous to their signing with CBS on the two Elektra albums that were
exactly.
Not
Stock Forest Group, right.
Well, I think their whole thing is we're too good musicians to sound like Sabbath. We have to put our own kind of spin on it.
The crucial BOC thing for me has always been the introduction of Eric Bloom. Once you got Eric Bloom in there, you completely changed the chemistry and the sound. I honestly believe if it had been Buck Darm and the other guys, Les Bronstein before whatever, it was Avocado Mafia. They would have been the American Grateful Dead. The introduction of Eric Bloom was sort of that last step to turn them into the sinister, amazing band that we love today.
Well, when to name check Martin again, Martin Poffop's book, Blue Oyster Cult Secrets Revealed.
Yep.
It's well documented now that their CBS deal was contingent on them trying to sound like Black Sabbath. Wow. They actually told their manager, I'll give you guys a deal if you can be the American Black Sabbath. And the manager came back to, Sandy Pearlman came back to the band and asked them, can you do this? And they all thought about it for a little while and said, yeah, we can try it. So that was a preconceived kind of a move. So,
right.
And did they pull it off? I don't know if they did or if they didn't, but they certainly evolved into their own fascinating thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what's our next one?
Our next one would be White Witch, A Spiritual Greeting. And that came out, what was that year? I'll look it up real quick. But go ahead, why don't you start that off, Horace?
I'll be happy to start that one off. I don't know how the hell I discovered this band. I think it was just pure blind chance because I really like Southern rock, but I'm so far from a Southern rock expert. For me, it's like, I like Leonard Skinner, Molly Hatchet is cool. Absolutely love Blackfoot, but Blackfoot for a lot of people were like, that was sort of the Southern rock band that metalheads just sort of gravitated towards. But somehow I stumbled across White Witch, which, probably was the album cover. So the thing that makes White Witch so fascinating is, they were signed to Capricorn Records, which was the House of Southern Rock royalty. We're talking the Allman Brothers label. And what makes them completely insane is you have a Southern rock band with a lot of hard rock moves, but also deeply into some very bizarre occultist shit. So the whole thing with that band is they're like, I'm not going to say they were Satan worshipers, but there's something super freaky going on there. And one of the centerpieces of that album is a song called Antichristo /Harlow, which actually has the lead singer, who doesn't really sound like anybody else on the planet, reciting the number of the beast Book of Revelation speech, about the 666.
Right.
And the rest of the lyrics are throughout the album are weird science fiction songs like Classic 1999 about androids. And there's a lot of Satan on this record. And so the thing is, you would not expect that from a Southern rock band. And they had this great sound that was like kind of almost poppy because it was so catchy, but also kind of heavy. And they had a phenomenal drummer and a singer who somebody injected helium up his ass.
Remind me of the 70s version of The Darkness.
The 70s version of The Darkness. But it's twisted, it's weird, and that opening number, Moneybags, which is about, I guess, a rich guy that dies that everybody hated, it's catchy. And the whole album, just, for me, it works as just a really, really weird record. Mayo, what's your take on that one?
I look at it as a fun curio. It's a little tough for me to take this guy seriously. He's just so off the wall. He's an amazing singer. He really is. He's Robert Plant in one song. He sings with a British accent, a really pronounced British accent in another. He's just it's kind of hilarious. And I think the song that you name checked, Horace, that's the one song that I think fits in with the hard rock and metal. The rest of it really didn't do it for me again. Maybe it's just a little too standard Southern rock. The lyrics, definitely out of this world. This guy is just nuts. But I think this should be on the list because I think as a curio, if people want to seek it out just because it's so oddball, it's definitely worth the hunt. Kind of reminds me of you guys. Hopefully you guys are aware of this, so I'm not referencing something that nobody's going to get. 26 and 6. Well, what's the name of that band?
2016 and then, yeah.
No,
yeah,
don't know.
Those guys, they have a song called Butter King. And while I was listening to this record, refreshing my memory on it last night, it reminded me of that song, Butter King by 2066 and then. Just really great musicianship, excellent musicianship, and they definitely had their own vision of what they wanted to sound like, and they definitely pulled it off. But just left field, real way out in left field.
I do remember them. I heard their songs back in the day. I think, again, the singer just, when I'd hear like a singer like that, especially when I was younger, it's like, this guy sucks. And I'll just like write him off kind of thing. And then I think you sent me a link, Horace, and I quite dug it. I mean, the voice was still annoying, but just so listeners know, this was their second album, 1974. On Capricorn.
Yeah, the first album is a little bit more generic and forgettable. They kind of found their, and also if you look at White Witch's publicity photos, they were always dressed in like ritual clothes, conical white hats.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing was just was just bat shit.
Their gimmick was white magic. That was their thing. Right. I guess they were trying to be the anti-Black Sabbath, like Angel was trying to be the anti-Kiss. But this singer reminds me a lot of the guy from Lone Star, Paul Chapman.
Oh, Paul Chapman's fan, yeah.
It definitely fits right in with that guy's vocal approach. In Lone Star, he was very Robert Plant, very high-pitched and very, even a little bit effeminate.
John Sloman,
Yeah. Great singer, fantastic singer, but...
who also was on Uriah Heep's worst album.
Well, that's debatable.
He's the singer on Conquest.
In that case, I agree.
Let's move on to Lucifer's Friend. Amazing. Definitely an underground classic, at least here in the U.S. Their debut record, I believe 72. I should have written the dates on here, but I'm just going off my head. Was that just 71 or 72?
I think
it 70?
The Lucifer's Friend album might be 1970. I think.
You know what? It did come out the same year as A Lonesome Crow, so I think you are correct. Why don't you start that out, Horace?
I mean, I really am trying not to just hog everything, but what I'll say about 1970. To me, the Lucifer's Friend debut is, if somebody came up to me and they said, just give me one album that's classic canon proto metal, and I'm like, it's that fucking Lucifer's Friend album. Definitely. Because it opens with that insane riff for Ride the Sky, which is basically Immigrant Song before Immigrant Song was written. And that's the other thing. I play that song for people and they're like, oh, that's a ripoff of Immigrant Song. I'm like, no, this came first.
Yeah.
So, and it has a French horn in it.
Which when I was a kid, because this is one of the first proto metal albums I heard, I thought it was an elephant.
That's what I thought. I thought they recorded like an elephant, from National Geographic or something, and put it on their record.
And let's just talk for a minute about how this album is the complete package. So you walk in, you see this, one of the evilest album covers you've ever seen. You're like, what's that goddamn dwarf up to? Yeah. What the hell is going on with these two? There's a pool of blood. The band's called Lucifer's Friend. Then you play the thing, opens with Ride the Sky. You're like, these guys are evil.
Demonic.
And they're German.
Yeah.
Maybe they're Nazis. I don't even know what the hell's going on here. And of course, they actually had a British vocalist, which is the twist.
John Lawton.
Which is the great John Lawton, who apparently is a Glenn Hughes type figure, because I know somebody that saw him live a couple of years ago. I guess he's in his 70s now, and said he can hit every single note that he could hit in 1970.
I'm not surprised. Not surprised.
He was great with Uriah Heep. Yeah.
Phenomenal singer. And once you get past that opening track, you get into some really heavy jamming kind of metal prog, where these kind of guys just kind of go at it. You know, that would be stuff like Toxic Shadows, Everybody's Clown. But it's just a phenomenal record with tons of energy. And I guess for people that aren't familiar with it, it's kind of in the Uriah Heep wheelhouse with a little bit of bit of a really ornery Deep Purple.
Definitely.
Excellent assessment. I think obviously John Lawton is fantastic. He's worth the price of admission all by himself. But when I listen to this album, I hear a band that could probably do anything they wanted, and what they chose to do was metal. And that's really gratifying, because when you get a band that's as talented and as capable as this bunch of guys, and they're focused on just completely blasting out, it's just fantastic. I think the guitar sound is fantastic. It was probably a couple of years ahead of its time. I think the album wanes a little bit as it goes along. By the end, I think it ends with the weakest stuff. And that's a shame, because it really is fantastic. And this is the lone record I think you can really call heavy metal, capital H, capital M.
Yep.
Until the new wave of British heavy metal album called Mean Machine, which was kind of a bandwagon hopping exercise.
Right.
80. Yeah, they were kind of jumping on the bandwagon at that time, and that it's really weak. But even I'd like to hear John Lawton sing the phone book. He's so good. Even on a weak record, he's worth listening to. But I love Lawton. This is one of the standouts on this list for everyone who's listening. If you haven't heard this one and you want to go out and grab one or two of these to check out, this is definitely one of the ones you want to grab.
They could have been the Scorpions. Again, they this album was released same year Lonesome Crow came out. They could have been the metal band from Germany to break. Yeah. But again, like so many other bands, their second, they have a fucking great debut. Montrose, are you listening? And then they just fade out from there. It's like, they started this great proto-heavy metal sound. I don't know if you want to call it kraut rock, kraut metal, but all these other kraut bands were very progressive. And Lucifer's Friend, don't get me wrong, there were a lot of progressive elements, but more in the heavy Uriah Heep, B3 organ, that deep demonic horn sound, the opening track. And if they carried on like that, and I mean, they've done eight albums.
They would have broken the bank. But I think what derailed Lucifer's Friend was that the key members had really long careers before that album as sort of German session musicians that had played with everybody. So all that wildly eclectic background, I think they made this amazing kind of heavy metal record. And then what happened was, because they were able to play everything from jazz to like the Les Humphrey Singers and all this other crap, pop, they were just like, oh, let's just try like some progressive thing. So they just kind of lost the plot and tried to become like a prog band or something else.
Well, you know what? Before we move on to our next one, I'm thinking, since we don't want to make these podcasts too long, we're already in about an hour. Why don't we do 10 on this? And then we could continue.
That's fine. Then we can do a part two.
Definitely. So
we're an hour and 11 minutes. Right?
Yeah, we'll go through 10. Then maybe we'll continue on at a later date. But let's move on to Blue Cheer, which is interesting. Everyone knows about their debut, Vincebus Eruptus. Is that how it's pronounced? Something like that.
Eruptum.
Eruptum.
Like
yeah.
But by the way, this one is Mayo's baby.
All right, Outside Inside, and to be honest, I'm only familiar with the debut album, so I don't really have much to say on this. But Bob, why don't you start it out? Outside Inside, 1968. Yeah.
Okay. So this is their second record, and it's already out before Black Sabbath's debut. So, in my estimation, I've written on this extensively. This is the band that started metal. And obviously, Vincebus Eruptum, their first album, is the classic that everybody talks about. It had the radio hit. It really put them on the map, and it's the go-to record for Blue Cheer. But the same lineup recorded another record. Their second album is called Outside Inside. I chose this one because no one ever talks about it, and it's really, really good. It might even be better. And I preface that with might. It doesn't have the impact of the first one because that one was really kind of unprecedented at the time, and it's like just a complete explosion. But Outside Inside, it's a different animal. It doesn't have that jamminess of the first one. The songs are more solid songwriting-wise. It doesn't have that kind of science experiment feel to the first one where they just seem to be kind of trying to harness that gargantuan volume. And they kind of focus on the songs more, and I appreciate that. Half the record was recorded outside on a pier, and the other half was recorded in a studio. That's where the title came from, Outside Inside. So you get one side recorded outside, live, and the other side recorded inside, probably live as well. There's a really cool instrumental on it called Magnolia Caboose Baby Finger, which is, I'm not going to say they invented speed metal. You read all that kind of catchphrase crap all the time, but it's a really quick and jammy instrumental. I recommend that if you're a fan of Vincebus Eruptum and you want to hear where this band took their next step, definitely check this record out. It's fantastic and criminally overlooked.
Horace, your thoughts?
No, I mean, I because prepping for the podcast, I actually this is a record that I've owned for years. Sundays did a very nice CD reissue of this a while ago, and I picked it up at the same time as they also did a nice job on Vincebus at the same time, and actually did something where they gave you the mono and the stereo mixes on the debut. So I was actually listening to this album Outside Inside today. I think Mayo hit on a lot of the key points about this record. Magnolia Caboose Baby Finger really is something else. And, it's a minute and a half, so, there's no reason not to check that out. But there's a few other really good songs on this. I'm a big fan of Babylon, which is a closing track. And Feathers from Your Tree is a great song. Gypsy Ball. Yeah, I would say it doesn't have the impact of the first one, because that's like, you're birthing out a monster there. But it's a more diverse and artistically accomplished record than the debut. The debut gets by a lot on, what the fuck am I listening to here? This is crazy, for the year. So I think this is, and also just a shout out to Lee Stevens, who was a fine guitarist. I mean, I think he's still with us. But I think he developed like deafness or something, and so he can't really play anymore. But he's in really good form. And I'm sure Mayo and I think we've even talked about this. Blue Cheer had a really good drummer.
Yeah, he was great. Just
who never quite got his due.
We should have got David Tedds on this one. He could have told the whole story about this band.
He's a big Blue Cheer, or he's got a story about Paul Whaley.
Oh yeah, he's got stories about everything about this band. But they were kind of an enigma. I mean, they were based in the Bay Area, like you say. Definitely, what could be considered. Everyone will argue what is metal or what isn't. We all would say Black Sabbath invented metal, but many will argue it was Blue Cheer, and including David Tedds. As far as sound wise. That kind of vibe going. All you have to do is
listen to those recently released 1967 demos. They're absolutely mind-blowing. That's 1967. And those are the three demos for Second Time Around, Dr. Please, and Summertime Blues. And that's the heaviest shit you ever heard in your life.
And it makes you wonder if the band, so many bands, from drugs and whatever, they just got derailed. If a band like Blue Cheer was around throughout the 70s, it makes you wonder how big and how influential they would have been on the entire metal scene. Could they have been the American Black Sabbath? Could they have been branched out into something more of a Deep Purple or a Zeppelin? I mean, it's always interesting to the what if
nobody
questions.
Knows.
Yeah,
nobody knows. There's another really interesting twist with Blue Cheer, which is when they got in, they had a very short term guitarist guy named Randy Holden, who's kind of a fascinating figure.
Yes.
And he plays on a few songs on this sort of mishmash album called New Improved, which came out in 1969. And the tracks that he plays on, specifically this insane song called Fruit and Icebergs, that's total proto-metal. And it's, like fuzzy, dark, heavy. And then, there's other stuff mixed on that album that could be the Grateful Dead. So it just seemed like they were kind of a star-crossed band. I think they just, things just never quite cut their way. I don't, kind of like Iron Butterfly.
Very similar. Interesting. Yeah. Well, let's move on to Cactus, the debut Cactus album. And who wants to, I hear some laughter there.
I'm just laughing because I love that band to death. I don't know how big a fan Mayo is.
1969 was the debut record. Why don't you start out, Horace?
All right. So here's the thing with Cactus. I have a long-lasting, slightly problematic relationship with the mighty Led Zeppelin, and most of my problems had to do with the fact that I thought they were kind of sloppy live a lot of the time, and I thought they were overrated. But honestly, if I'm being brutally honest, a lot of my problems with Led Zeppelin centered around Robert Plant, who I thought just brought a little bit too much girly man mojo to the table sometimes. So this ties into Cactus because my running gag with Cactus was somebody would ask me to describe Cactus, and I would say it's the American Led Zeppelin without the hippy-dippy bullshit. They're not going to ask you if you remember Laughter. Rusty Day was the original, complete badass rock and roll outlaw. This is a guy who died by being machine gunned to death after a drug deal. You can't get a bigger badass than Rusty Day. He was a genuinely dangerous guy. Anyway, so he's the singer, and he's got this great, crazy, powerful, ballsy, gritty kind of voice. And he's backed by this really aggressive, they're like blues, but they're blues that's trying to kill you. And you've got the great Carmen Appice on drums, who I guess after Vanilla Fudge, he was like, let's ditch the organ and get really heavy. So the whole thing is like, it's the ultimate monster truck boogie rally band. And you have a feeling if you were at a Cactus gig at a certain time, you were probably taking your life in your hands.
I wasn't familiar with their history as far as that goes. Why don't you give your thoughts, Bob?
Sure. Cactus is the one band that when I decided to travel back in time and see what I had missed, when I found Cactus, my mind completely exploded. I could not believe that something so fantastic had completely escaped my discovery for so long. It's Van Halen. It's basically Van Halen's first album several years earlier, 10 years earlier. It's that kick-ass. The rhythm section, we spoke about Golden Earrings rhythm section. These guys were complete monster players. And you could just listen to these two guys, Tim Bogert and Carmen Appice. You could just listen to these guys with Rusty Day, and it would still be completely kick-ass. But Jim McCarty, the guitar player, was amazing. Jim McCarty, who ended up in the Rockets for a brief time later on.
Detroit guy, right?
All Detroit. Totally badass songs, chops for miles, and probably, I'm going to say it, I think we already said this about Golden Earring, but probably the greatest rhythm section in heavy rock. And all you need to do is just listen to this record and tell me if you disagree. They play their asses off. And again, as Horace said, Rusty Day, he just added a layer of bluesy authenticity right across the top, and a fantastic harmonica player, too. Fantastic. These guys were the real deal. You didn't know, at a meet and greet, they're going to sell you a bag of pot and pull a knife on you. They were way before my time. But finding this band was a huge eye-opener for me, that there was so much more out there to discover, and I'm really grateful that I found them. And I actually have the Rhino CD set. It has all the studio material, I think, on 3 CDs. It's way out of print, but it's well worth hunting down. All of their records with this lineup are fantastic.
Absolutely.
And I would say to people out there interested in checking out Cactus, there were some very expensive Rhino handmade live sets where they came in 2 volumes. But the thing with Cactus now is, for those, we do a little pimping for good old Hugh Gilmore here. If you want their classic catalog, it's all now on Hear No Evil recordings at very reasonable price, very nicely remastered with bonus tracks. And you can get, the first 3, all the major Cactus albums now have, inexpensive, very nice CD reissues. But the only other thing I would say about Cactus is, to further what Mayo was saying, you're looking at one of the greatest rhythm sections that you're ever going to hear. And the thing with these guys is, when they played live, they could play the song Evil, which was kind of like their masterpiece for covers, the Willie Dixon thing. They could play that for 20 minutes. You are never going to get bored.
They were masters of their craft.
And I do want to mention, because there was always a lot of confusion, this is Jim McCarty, the guitarist of Cactus, not the drummer from the Yardbirds by the same name.
No.
Because he was around the same era.
Jim McCarty, the Axe Man. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I am a Vanilla Fudge fan, but I was like, this is so much heavier. And if you're into drumming, Carmen Appice is a great drummer, but this is Carmen's best shit. Is the stuff he does in Cactus.
And it's surprising, this album. I mean, now, a lot of people go back with, the debut Montrose record as such a great American historic metal record, but very few people mention this debut Cactus album. And I mean, you could definitely hear the attitude of coming from this album. It was interesting what you
I
said.
think they were undone by, and
well, that was the thing.
Talked about this at length. They were undone by the absolute level of insanity of Rusty Day. I mean, Rusty Day really was one crazy motherfucker.
Yeah.
So I think going on tour with a guy who was probably conducting drug deals backstage, probably had knives and guns on him at all times. Might have dropped the wrong drugs and gotten super paranoid and wanted to kill people. It could be a tricky ecosystem to manage on the road.
Sure.
And they did, by the way. And also the record label didn't like Rusty Day. So what finally happened with Cactus was they kind of edged him out, and they brought in a guy named Peter French, who we know from Atomic Rooster, to sing on their final studio record. And then it just sort of. So I think it was drugs, business, personality clashes. Because I think Appleseed has actually talked about how difficult it was to sort of manage the three personalities.
Yeah, he has.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. We got two albums left here on this discussion. We'll move on to Night Sun, Morning. I believe that was that your pick there, Horace? Or
no, that
did
was
both
Bob.
of yours? That was Bob. Okay.
That was Mayo.
Well, why don't you start that one out, Mayo?
Okay. All right. This album is completely nuts. Completely nuts. The song Plastic Shotgun. I'm not even going to waste any syllables trying to describe it. If you haven't heard it, I'm just going to recommend that you go to YouTube or something and listen to it. It's insane, and you will thank me. It's just off the wall craziness. This record is impeccably played. These guys were kind of like Deep Purple-y in their instrumentation and their approach. But again, as I think we mentioned before, we believe them to be German.
Yeah, they are German.
They are German. I checked. They're German.
Yeah, okay. They really had a handle on this sound, though, and you get the impression that they could do just about anything, and they do on this record. There's a lot of ground covered on this record. The dynamics are fantastic. The guitarist is a complete maniac. The vocals are also really bold and really manic. He's a great singer, too. By the way, I really don't know too much about the band themselves, but this record is fantastic, and I can't find the damn thing on CD for less than $100. So I actually
I've had it on CD for decades. Second Battle put it out.
I don't own this record, so
wow.
It's my favorite. Right. It's definitely the favorite album that I put on this list to discuss, hands down. But I do not own it. So there you go.
Yeah, it's one of those albums that I discovered this album during a very interesting phase in my life when I had, because I buy so much stuff, I'm obsessed. I had a bunch of record and CD dealers that I dealt with. And one of the guys that I dealt with was a very difficult progressive rock snob who did not like heavy rock, didn't like heavy metal, but he would occasionally stock sort of outlier krautrock that sort of crossed into the line. And to give you an idea where this guy was coming from, this was a guy who thought Lucifer's Friends' progressive albums were really good, but that the debut was them slumming it,
right.
And kind of disreputable.
I had a lot of friends like that.
I used to have hilarious phone conversations with this guy who, I guess he kind of liked me, but he would be really sniffy. And he would be on the phone with me, and one day he said, well, I have this thing, and I don't know, you'd probably like it. It's a little too heavy for me, and it was Night Sun Morning. And he said, I think you might like this. And he had the Second Battle CD. Second Battle were a very tiny reissue label from Germany. I think the other big thing they put out was the Weed album with Ken Hensley, which is also sort of a proto-metal thing.
Right. Yeah.
And it's Ken Hensley under a fake name or something. And so he suggested this CD. I think I paid, I don't know, $20, $30 for it. And I got it, and I was like, this thing is completely insane. It's like Mayo was saying, and to me what it was krautrock crossed with metal, with just this really wild kind of but the two songs that Plastic Shotgun is essential, and there's also a song called Living with the Dying, which is kind of like their moody epic. But this was a great example of one of those heavy records that crosses a bunch of genres. So you're sort of like, am I listening to heavy metal krautrock? Am I listening to proto metal? Am I listening to just some crazy German thing? But I think for those of you with more eclectic taste, the only caveat I would have on this record is you have to be a little musically adventurous, because this is one weird-ass album. You know, if you're looking for a Stars record, and I love Stars, this ain't going to be it. But if you want something a little bit whacked out,
challenging.
check it out. Challenging.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And speaking from the musician's point of view here, it's amazing what these guys pull off as a group together. The songwriting is prog, it really is. But the edge that they bring to it and the grit that they bring to it, they pull off the subtle stuff exceptionally well, and the intensely heavy stuff really well, and the crazy stuff really well too. This band, I mean, so many of the records that we're talking about here are just one-offs. The band's, released one, maybe two records and disappeared. I would love to hear what this band would have done 3 or 4 more albums down the line. I mean, look where Deep Purple ended up after 3 records.
Yeah.
Or look what Deep Purple did with their second lineup. What was Deep Purple's third record for their second lineup was Machine Head. If you gave Night Sun 2 more records and some crazy touring schedules, what would they have come up with? It's just mind-boggling.
What you're saying there is so true that I think bands broke up. I don't know if they were expecting the instant success or the labels were. I mean, you got to remember, even the Scorpions, who now is one of the biggest hard rock metal bands in the world, let alone just Germany. They were an underground German band, and up until you could say up until maybe Virgin Killer, or even go further to a Love Drive, they were practically unknown here in the States. And a lot of these bands, they weren't selling tons of records, but they kept it together and they progressed. And if Scorpions broke up after in Trance, you would have never known.
We might never hear of them. But there's also an aspect when you're dealing with the German bands, especially in this late 60s, early 70s period, there was a little bit of like that sweet shop thing where like you had professional musicians that were sort of like, recording jingles on a Saturday, forming a band on a Monday, doing something else on a Wednesday. And I think Night Sun is another collective where you probably had 3-4 guys that were in 5-6 bands at once get together and make this record. But I think the German scene in that period was a lot less organic than, it's not like Riot in the USA where they're like, we're all four pals from Brooklyn and let's form a band and, we're going to pursue a career. It's more like, oh yeah, well, I did 5 studio gigs. Like maybe I'll record this album with 3 other guys.
True.
But did they have like a real plan? And what were like sort of the record labels were kind of like more fly by night kind of German labels that were just like, okay, well, we'll do this, we'll do that. And, you see stuff like this with the Thin Lizzy guys popping over to pick up a couple of bucks doing the Deep Purple tribute, the Funky Junction thing. I think a lot of what we're missing is that what was missing in the German scene was that sort of organic, let's form a band, stay together, plot a career.
Well, that's a good point you bring up because, this was produced by Connie Plank, who was you wonder how instrumental he was in creating the German scene, much like Dieter Dierks with the Scorpions. But Connie Plank, there's a great documentary I want to plug that came out on Cleopatra about Connie Plank and his association with krautrock. And it does kind of tie in that, a lot of these guys were big, session players, and that's how they made money. I know a lot of the European bands, from French bands to everything, they were session guys that came together in bands, like the guys of Warning. But yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder how much truth that is what you say, because this was a band I never heard of. They were on Polydor, apparently, a label called Zebra. It came out in 1972, and I went back and checked it out. I was going, wow, I thought I knew a lot about the German bands. I knew obviously about Scorpions, Lucifer Friend, Amandul, all these different, krautrock bands, Eloy, whatever. But you're always discovering something new, and it's kind of astonishing that this album is still remains so underground.
Let me cut in really quick because I just went on Discogs, and guess what? Connections with 2066 and Then.
Really?
Oh wow.
Which Bob Mayo had mentioned earlier. It says profile, it's just a couple sentences. Night Sun were an early 1970s German rock band who came from the Mannheim area. They were interconnected with the likes of Kin, Ping, Meh, and 2066 and Then. The lineup wasn't stated on the LP release, but has been documented widely as Bruno Schaub, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, there's a lot of 6 degrees of separations separation shit going on here.
Well, I think
that's
that
the
also
quality
played
of the German
into.
scene.
I think it also played into the Lucifer Friend story too. I think that collaborative, collective kind of idea where these guys are just professional musicians and they're kind of interchanging themselves and saying, hey, what do you want to do? What's selling right now? Oh, you want to do a hard rock record? Okay, let's do that. And then you got Lucifer's Friend. And that kind of explains why maybe the next one wasn't the same thing, because it wasn't a huge hit, didn't make them a ton of money. So they said, let's try something different next time.
Interesting. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to our final record of this discussion. Ursa Major, a great band. And again, a band I was turned on to by the great David Tedds. I was always familiar with the band. I always saw their album in the used record section as a kid, read about them for whatever reason. I never picked up on the record. So I just discovered them fairly recently. A fantastic album, debut Ursa Major. Why don't you start that off, Horace?
Well, the thing with this is it's another great example of one of the great underground one and done albums. These guys never made another album. Yep. Too bad they didn't, because this one's amazing. And the main calling card on this is Dick Wagner, who of course spent a lot of time playing on some of Alice Cooper's biggest stuff. Aerosmith,
Kiss.
Welcome to My Nightmare. All kinds of stuff. And also, I think Mayo knows more about this than I do. Wasn't he one of the great hired guns? Something went wrong in the studio and you needed to get like a really good guitar player quick. This was one of the guys you called to like lay down the lead.
That's true. He was kind of Bob Ezrin's go-to guy. So Bob Ezrin did the Alice Cooper stuff. He did Destroyer. And he came to Aerosmith via Jack Douglas, who used to be an engineer for Bob Ezrin. So they're all basically connected to Ezrin. But yeah, Dick Wagner was that ghost guitarist that when Ace Frehley showed up too drunk to play, or Glenn Buxton couldn't play what he wrote, he would just save the money and save the time and call in Dick Wagner.
Or if Joe Perry couldn't play. So when you hear Train Kept a Rolling, that guitar work, that is all Dick Wagner.
Back to Ursa Major. Ursa Major is Dick Wagner front and center. He's not hiding behind anything. This is really Dick Wagner's baby, if I remember correctly. Now, I don't know much about the other guys that play in it. All of the musicians are really good. But the songs are great. And the guitar playing is fantastic. And it also is a great example of that kind of politically aware sort of songwriting. It's a really great song on it called Liberty and Justice, which is basically, one of those huge, like, stop screwing the black man in this country kind of anthems. And so there's almost a tie-in to that whole 60s political ethos on this album.
Right. He was from Detroit.
Yes, right.
And they were from Detroit. From Detroit. So, and I think that's also where, there's some Cactus connections there. So that's one of, the great badass American rock and roll cities, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
And I love that album, but I think the two centerpieces on it are the opening track Sinner, which is just a great cascading, and then there's also the sex song, or no, it's not really a sex song. Silver Spoon is the other one. That has some amazing drumming on it. It's got some real great cowbell, like up tempo. And I think the whole album is only 7 songs, if I remember correctly. So
yeah,
it's kind of
7 tracks.
Yep.
It's 7 tracks, and it's not a short album, but it never feels like too jammy or too long. Everything seems pretty tight and focused on it.
Well, that was great about albums back then. You could have 7, 8 songs, but it was every song was so different. It was incredible. You didn't need 14 songs like on a CD. You could have a 7-song album and just be happy as hell. Yes.
Yeah, and what you've got with this one is you've got, the American Indian song "Back to the Land." This was a big thing in the 70s. Like, let's write a song about American Indians. Also Red Man on the first Bang album. So you've got Back to the Land, you've got Liberty and Justice, Silver Spoon, and then they got to have like a fuck rock song. So you have Stage Door Queen. We all know what that's about. And then, the big sort of epic ballad, which is, In My Darkest Hour, which is really one of the highlights of the album. Now what's strange about this album though, is it never got a lot of reissues. It had the original LP, and it has one of those weird classics CDs that had like the thing in the corner. And then that's kind of it. I mean, I'm looking at the various pressings of it now. And I feel like
1972, it came out on RCA Records. But again, it was one of those bands that probably could have been huge if they stuck around. But you never really heard anything about this, even till this day. You're right, no reissues. Because, a lot of people look at, these albums as their underground classics. And this really went under the radar for whatever reason, because I think it's one of the greatest American debut albums.
The CD I have is from a really kind of sketchy label called, what is it? It's not Pearls from the Past, Collectibles, which was that weird label that put out they also put out the Highway Robbery album. And that was, 2000. And since then it's had nothing. So HNE, Hugh Gilmore, take care of this album.
The real revelation for me with this record was, you find out that Dick Wagner played on all your favorite Aerosmith and Kiss albums and Alice Cooper albums. So who's this Dick Wagner guy? Then you start digging and you find out that he actually led a band and did an album. So you go seek out the album and you expect amazing guitar playing, which you absolutely get. But what you also get is great vocals, which was a complete mind blower. He's a great rock vocalist.
He is.
Outstanding. That was a huge surprise.
And I think what happened with this is that he disappeared down the Bob Ezrin rabbit hole. I think this album came out, and then he developed some sort of relationship with Ezrin, and he just got so much damn work through Ezrin that he just probably didn't have time to run his own band.
Yeah, that could be. I saw him recently, just before he passed. He did like this autograph. It was like this really weird thing. Like Jim Dandy was there. A lot of great old school classic rock metal guys. Lou Gramm was there, but Dick Wagner did a performance with Jim Dandy and a bunch of other people, and it was just amazing to see him. And he was, like I said, just before he passed, so he was quite old, but he still kicked ass. And I did an interview with him. Great guy. But yeah, very historic. It's a shame because by name, nobody knows Dick Wagner. But like you said, most of that classic albums of the 70s, from Kiss to Aerosmith to Alice Cooper, he's played on. So everyone knows of his playing, but they just don't know him, And it is kind of one of those unfortunate things.
Like, but we need to mention this briefly. This sounds like a Mayo noise topic. I think we need the ghost musicians.
Yeah. Some are happy being session players and just getting paid as session players and being the nameless kind of person.
Did you cover this, Mayo, on one of your blog posts?
I did. I'll send you the link. I have covered Dick Wagner and his entire history and how this all came to be. Everything we've just mentioned. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow.
The last thing I'll say about this record is it doesn't sound like a first album. It doesn't sound like a
very
debut.
Mature.
It's really focused. The songwriting is strong from A to Z. It does not sound like a brand new band. It sounds like maybe somebody's third or fourth record. It's that strong.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And I think Wagner's had been in a band for a while before this called The Frost, which I think he actually did 3 albums with, right? So he was almost a little seasoned by this point.
That will end this portion, or this episode, I should say. Well, guys,
we'll just have to have Monty and me on alone, and we'll just fight over Born Again just by itself. Anyway,
love it. All right, gentlemen, Bob and Horace.
What I would like to do, though, is if we just have a couple of minutes, is I think Bob Mayo should have a chance to mention his blog, which
absolutely
we touched on it all.
I was going to say, give out
and
your
I'll quickly mention
websites.
the site that I write for, in addition to this great podcast that you put us on.
All right, Bob, why don't you give out your links and so forth?
Okay, cool. It's on WordPress, and the name of the blog is Mayo Noise. It's like a play on mayonnaise. But it's MayoNoise. And if you search for WordPress and Mayo Noise, you will find my blog. And I've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, fairly regularly, and it's backstory. It's backstory on the bands that we're talking about here today, the records that we're talking about. It's metal history. It's I try to look into some of the darker corners and fill in some gaps with history and some insight and hopefully a little bit of humor. And hopefully you guys will check it out and you'll dig it.
And I will just say that I've been reading it for a few years, and it's a terrific site. And also, Bob Mayo really is one of the best experts out there on certain topics, and it's always a good read. And if you want to learn a lot of interesting stuff that's Motorhead related, new wave of British heavy metal, Bob has a lot of really interesting stuff, and his entries are always a really good read. So I would absolutely, and he's good. Bob probably isn't willing to do this, but I will. He's been published in Classic Rock Magazine, and he did a thing on those hidden Black Sabbath song titles that was absolutely amazing, real detective work.
Wow.
Okay. Definitely check it out, guys, especially if you're Sabbath and Motorhead fans, and all the stuff that we were talking about tonight. And as for me, I also write for a site, but it's a bigger, more of a like traditional, and it's a film, because the other thing I'm a big expert on is film. It's called Film, but it's a film and music site, and it's called Rock Shock Pop. And if you go over there, you can just type my name in the search bar and everything the last two big music related things I did was I reviewed the new Annihilator album, and I probably wrote the longest review of a Rods album that anybody's ever going to read for the last Rods album, which is Brotherhood of Metal, which I'm a massive Rods fan. They're sort of like my meat and potatoes metal guys, because I have a huge history with them going back to when I was a kid. And they were, everybody's got their band. Those were like my boys. Right. So I wrote about that. And I write about film and music by all means. And the whole site is filled with stuff like that. So check it out.
Awesome. Well, Bob and Horace, I've learned so much from this, man. We will definitely keep in touch. It's a pleasure having you on. We will get you on for part 2, and we will definitely get you on for some future podcasts, because I definitely know our fans will love your educating them on some of the lesser known metal bands. So once again, thanks again. And we will see you next time.
Okay. Thank you.